Hello friends, today we're going to talk about solving for an angle in a right triangle using trig. Our state standard: apply the trigonometric ratios sine, cosine, and tangent to solve problems. Know how to use calculators, tables, or other technology to evaluate trigonometric ratios. So if you remember back to when you first learned how to solve equations, x plus 4 equals 12, so we need to do the opposite or the inverse of adding 4, which is subtracting 4. So we would get x equals 8. 4 times x, the inverse of multiplication is division. So we would divide both sides by 4 and get x equals 3. X squared is 49. The inverse of squaring is square rooting. So square root both sides, and we would get x is positive and negative 7. So as it turns out, sine, cosine, and tangent also have an opposite, and they are called inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. So not sine -1, cosine to the -1, tangent to the -1, inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. So here, if we're trying to solve for theta, theta should be right here. If that's our reference angle, we have hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. I can see I know the opposite and adjacent side here, so we would be using tangent. So if tangent x is 15/12, and we want to get x by itself, we need to do inverse tangent on both sides. Remember, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And then you would put this in your calculator. For most of the calculators, you just push second and then tangent, and that will bring up inverse tangent. So you would do inverse tangent of 15 divided by 12. Here, the inverse tangent and tangent cancel each other out. So we would be left with x is about 51.34 degrees. So if we just practice solving for these in our calculator, this first one, again, I would do inverse sine then on both sides. Inverse sine of sine A equals inverse sine of 3/5. Inverse sine and sine cancel. So if you did inverse sine of 3 divided by 5 in your calculator, you would get 36.87 degrees. Here we would do inverse cosine on both sides. So if you put inverse cosine of 2/7 into your calculator, you would get that the measure of angle B is about 73.40 degrees. We're rounding to the nearest hundredth for all these. And then this one, we would do inverse tangent on both sides. And if you did inverse tangent of 8/11 on your calculator, you would get that C is about 36.03 degrees. If you're putting these in your calculator and you're getting different answers, be sure that your calculator is in degrees and not in radians. So let's look at an example here. Here's the steps we're going to do. Circle our reference angle. In this case, it's that angle N there. So from there, we know this is the hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. And it looks like we know the hypotenuse and the adjacent, so we're going to be using cosine. So I know that cosine of x is adjacent over hypotenuse. If we did inverse cosine on each side, and put that into your calculator, inverse cosine of 12/24 would mean that x is 60 degrees. So get another one here. Here's our reference angle, hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. Here it's hypotenuse and opposite, so we're going to be using sine. Sine of x is opposite over hypotenuse, which then means that x is inverse sine of 13/30, which means that x would be about 40.54 degrees. Make sure you're putting the degree symbol because we're solving for an angle. That's how we label an angle. Here they want us to find measure of angle T. So we have hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. We know the hypotenuse and adjacent, so we're going to be using cosine. So cosine of T is 5/9, which means T is going to be inverse cosine of 5/9, which will give us about 56.25 degrees. Let's look at a few more here. Here's our reference angle, hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. We're dealing with hypotenuse and adjacent, so cosine. So cosine of question mark is 40/48, which means our question mark then would be inverse cosine of 40/48, which means our question mark then would equal 33.56 degrees. So get a few more here. Our reference angle, hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. We know hypotenuse and adjacent, so we'll be dealing with cosine again. So cosine of question mark is 15/32, which means our question mark then would be inverse cosine of 15/32. And putting that in our calculator, we would get that our question mark is about 62.05 degrees. Finally, one more here. Here's our reference angle, hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. So we have hypotenuse and adjacent, which means we're using cosine again. So cosine of question mark is 10/19, which means question mark then would be inverse cosine of 10/19. And our question mark would equal about 58.24 degrees. All right, so again, just make sure that you use these steps. If you're confused on how to start or get lost, follow those 5 steps. All right, have a nice day.